The insanity, according to most of the people who have studied it posthumously, was probably a general paralysis, in which case there must presumably have been a syphilitic infection. Those who have studied the matter dispassionately have charged that Nietzsche may, as a student, once or twice have visited a brothel. This is not well attested, but it certainly is very possible. It's also possible, not that it greatly matters to me, I don't see why it should matter to you, that when he was a medical orderly during the Franco-Prussian War, he might have become infected as he was taking care of sick soldiers. What does matter, what is relevant, is whether Nietzsche's works can be shrugged off as the writings of a madman. And this is a popular idea with people who don't know much psychology, with amateur psychologists, but perhaps it's interesting to hear what Freud thought of Nietzsche. Freud said of Nietzsche that he had, and I quote, a more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived or was ever likely to live. Rather a handsome compliment. I think I'm not at all sure that it's true, but I find it quite stunning anyway, that he had a more penetrating knowledge of himself than any other man who ever lived or was ever likely to live. That presumably includes Sigmund Freud himself. He also said of Nietzsche that his insights often agree in the most amazing manner with the laborious results of psychoanalysis. And that although in his later years Freud didn't have any particular enthusiasm for Nietzsche, whose whole temperament was very different from his own in many respects. There's no need, I think, to go over a list here of Nietzsche's books. They're usually divided into three periods. First, things like The Birth of Tragedy and The Untimely Meditations, essays, then as aphoristic works, the ones that really are aphoristic, that consist of lots of short sections strung together, and then in this final period, first Thus Spoke Zarathustra, then Beyond Good and Evil, Genealogy of Morals, and then finally, in his last conscious year, 1888, he equaled Kierkegaard by writing in 1 year The Case of Wagner, The Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, and composing out of things written earlier, Nietzsche contra Wagner. Now, there is an enormous amount to be said about Nietzsche's philosophy, which I shall not say tonight, and perhaps this is a good moment to give you briefly some bibliographical suggestions for Nietzsche and for this whole series of 3 lectures. If you are willing to look at 2 books, assuming that you haven't already read one or both, the 2 that I would advise, both in connection with Nietzsche and with this whole section of 3, and in terms of which I think you would get much more out of the whole series than if you just listen to the lectures, are Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, mainly for texts by the men themselves, and my From Shakespeare to Existentialism for interpretations of the men, including Nietzsche. For Kierkegaard, if you want to do some additional reading, I would say the work of his to read is Fear and Trembling, the work about him to read, which also is available, like everything I am mentioning, in paperback, Walter Lowry's Short Life of Kierkegaard, which is enormously sympathetic and I think illuminating. That's a paperback by the Princeton University Press. The others are respectively Anchor and Meridian. For Nietzsche, for the texts, the portable Nietzsche, there are some important works that are in the Modern Library Giant Nietzsche and not in the portable, and vice versa for that matter. I do think that some of the translations in the Modern Library Giant are travesties. For an interpretation of Nietzsche that covers points that I shall not bring up tonight, there's my own little Meridian book on Nietzsche. And for Sartre, whom I want to discuss next week, if you want to read one thing by him, in addition to the things in Existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, I'd suggest No Exit and 3 other plays, and preferably of those, No Exit and The Flies. And if you're willing to tackle a big university press book, that is a very good secondary text on French existentialism, Hazel Barnes, The Literature of Possibility. Now, to speak briefly about Nietzsche's philosophy, I will first mention 2 major misconceptions of Nietzsche. One of them, Nietzsche as a Nazi, a view that used to be popular in this country during World War II, but also was popular in Germany just preceding World War II, although I think not quite as popular really in Germany as here, because more people in Germany knew their Nietzsche, had read him, and knew how many things there were in Nietzsche that didn't square with Nazism. And I dare say that this view is quite universally abandoned by Nietzsche scholars. I don't think that on this I wouldn't be afraid to say so if I stood alone on this and if I thought I was right against the world, but that is not the situation. In fact, I think that Nietzsche scholars are pretty well agreed that this is a very serious misreading of Nietzsche, that Nietzsche, to give a couple of examples, did not say, my ideal is Cesare Borgia, but he said that he liked even Cesare Borgia better than Parsifal, and that wasn't saying very much coming from Nietzsche. Or when he spoke of the blonde beast, which he did, I think, all of 3 times, he had in mind by the blonde beast a lion, and was referring to the brute health and strength of the Teutonic races before they became Christianized. He did think there was something nice about a lion, but if you want to know what he really seriously as a philosopher thought of the blonde beast and of the lion, you need read no further than the first chapter, the first chapter now and not the prologue, of Zarathustra, where you get the image of the lion as not the highest thing. There are 3 transformations or metamorphoses, and the first one is the camel, the beast of burden that humbly accepts tradition, then the lion, the beast, the revolutionary that throws it off, and finally the creative child. And so for Nietzsche, quite generally, there's not high-handed exegesis, but quite generally, the blonde beast was very far from being his ideal. And so one could run through various other slogans that have been misinterpreted. I won't do it now. In the chapter on how Nietzsche revolutionized morals from Shakespeare to existentialism, you will find a very brief treatment, one after the other, of these major misconceptions. The only other one that I do want to mention is that among those who have given up any notion that Nietzsche was a Nazi are those who have developed about him what you might call the incoherence theory, namely that he was completely incoherent and that he said absolutely anything on any subject that just happened to come to his mind. In a kind of rarefied or sublimated way, this theory is championed by Karl Jaspers, who sees Nietzsche in some such way and sees great glory in this. He thinks this is a wonderful thing because whatever position you may adopt, Nietzsche sort of shocks you out of it by saying something else, and so you are, in Jaspers' words, set whirling. Now, if one reads Nietzsche the way Karl Jaspers reads him, which is by way of file cards that you write down juicy quotations, and then you sort of look now at this and now at that, you can be set whirling, that's very true, but you can do something like that, not quite so easily, but quite a number of writers. In fact, with all writers of very great scope, perhaps. Certainly you could do it with Plato, for example. I think that Nietzsche isn't as incoherent as all that there is in Nietzsche a coherent doctrine. The other existentialists agree on that. Heidegger finds a coherent doctrine in him, albeit one that I don't find in him. Sartre and Camus, I think, find some coherence in him, so do any number of people. Now, I could briefly mention some of these doctrines at least, and I will dwell relatively longest, I'll be brief on all of these points, on Nietzsche's psychology. This relates him, as most of the things that I am stressing do, even if I don't keep emphasizing it in every sentence, this relates him to existentialism. What the existentialists have in common is their concern with human nature, with human existence. Now, psychology has been a traditional concern of philosophers. Plato was interested in psychology, Aristotle was, Spinoza was in a big way, Hume was, as I mentioned before. But in Nietzsche there are several innovations. The first one is that he quite deliberately puts his conception of man, both of man as he is and of man as he might be, quite emphatically in the center of his thought, and coins a word for his idea of man as he might be. The word in German is Übermensch. In English this has sometimes been translated in a word that has become debased currency, Superman. It's better, I think, for a variety of reasons to use the word overman for it. Moreover, still much more interesting, Nietzsche, in considering the views of others, in his literary criticism, in his criticism of religion, and in his criticism of philosophers, looks for their visions of man, looks for the visions of man that they presuppose, perhaps unconsciously, explicates these hidden visions of man in other people's philosophies, and then criticizes them. And he bases his psychology on a much broader empirical fundament than I think any philosopher before him, which is what earned him Freud's compliments. His own major psychological concepts have been, I think, insufficiently studied and contrasted with those of Freud and Freud's successors. The chief ones are, first of all, the conception of the will to power.